The fluorescent lights hum their endless mechanical song as Megan O'Brien pushes a medication cart down the corridor of St. Michael's trauma unit, her movements deliberate and quiet. 3 months. 93 days, to be precise. Long enough to understand the rhythms of this place, short enough that nobody knows her name yet. She prefers it that way. A administrator walks past with a clipboard, and her fingers slip. The pen clatters against the tile floor, one sharp sound that echoes in the hallway like a gunshot. She bends to retrieve it, her jaw tightening for exactly one breath, then straightens with the pen secured. The administrator doesn't look back. Nobody ever does. The trauma unit of St. Michael's sprawls across the 3rd floor of a 10-story structure built in 1987, expanded twice, renovated once poorly. 14 trauma bays. 3 operating theaters. A supply closet in the northeast corner where the inventory management system crashed in 2019 and nobody bothered to fix it. That's where Megan spends her morning hours between shifts, counting vials of morphine, checking batch numbers against a ledger nobody reads anymore, photographing serial codes on her personal phone with the kind of methodical precision that would look strange to anyone actually paying attention. She isn't being paid to be noticed. She's being paid to be invisible. Inside the supply closet, surrounded by shelves of crystalloid saline and vacuum-sealed gauze, Megan photographs the 4th batch of pharmaceutical shipments this week. The vials are labeled correctly. The paperwork matches. But 3 batches in the last month have been diverted, rerouted through suppliers she's been instructed to monitor. The patient in bed 7, admitted with a compound fracture of the femur, has visitors at odd hours. Visitors who don't wear visitor badges. Her assignment is simple: document the diversion chain, photograph the evidence, report nothing until the operation is complete. The Army intelligence briefing came 3 months ago in a basement office at the Pentagon, delivered by a woman with major's insignia and eyes that had seen harder things than duty rosters. "You'll be a trauma nurse," the major said. "You'll fit in. You'll watch. You'll photograph everything. And you'll tell nobody, not your family, not your daughter, not your commanding officer, until we give the signal." Megan had asked one question: how long? The major had answered, as long as it takes. That was before the transfer to Raleigh. Before the 7-year-old had asked why Mommy couldn't talk about her new job. Before the quiet became heavier than the truth. Dr. Marcus Mercer arrives at St. Michael's on a Tuesday morning at 6:58, 2 minutes before rounds, which means he's been in the building since 5:30. Cardiovascular surgeon. 23 years at the hospital. Member of the country club on Creedmoor Road where the board members play golf every 3rd Saturday. The kind of man who has never been told no in any meaningful way. He walks through the trauma unit in navy scrubs with his name embroidered in white thread, not his title, just his name, as if the name alone carries the weight of authority. His eyes move across the unit with a detached appraisal of someone inspecting property he owns. He stops when he sees Megan completing a central line insertion on a 47-year-old trauma patient, gunshot wound to the left shoulder, blood loss at approximately 1,200 milliliters, pressure dropping incrementally. She works with her hands steady as surgical lasers, her movements economical and practiced. The needle enters at the correct angle. The guide wire threads smoothly. The catheter seats perfectly. 40 seconds from first touch to confirmation. Dr. Mercer narrows his eyes. He watches her check the placement, secure the dressing, update the flow rate on the 4-pump without speaking, without wasting movement, without once glancing up. He sees a mousy trauma nurse in oversized scrubs. He sees someone who dropped a pen in the hallway last week when she thought an administrator was watching. He sees the kind of woman who eats lunch alone and doesn't speak during staff meetings. What he doesn't see, what he cannot possibly see from this distance, are the pale surgical wire burn scars that run across her knuckles like a topographical map of survival. What he doesn't see is the faded unit patch sewn carefully into the lining of her jacket hanging in locker 47, the one that reads Valkyrie 6 in threadbare embroidery. What he doesn't see is the photograph of a 7-year-old girl taped to the inside of that same locker door, a child with her mother's eyes and the kind of serious expression that comes from being raised by someone who understands that the world breaks people without warning. Dr. Reynolds arrives for his shift at 7:15, moving through the unit with the kind of fluid precision that comes from having spent time in places where hesitation meant death. Former combat medic. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 3 Purple Hearts in a drawer at home he never opens. Now working anesthesia at St. Michael's, keeping one hand on his pension and one hand in the clinical world because sitting still feels like drowning. He's been on shift for 47 minutes when he watches Megan place a triple-lumen central line during a routine appendectomy assist, her hands moving with the kind of practiced confidence that doesn't come from hospital orientation videos. He studies her technique. The angle. The depth. The way her fingers position the needle with microsurgical precision. He watches her tie off the dressing with something that looks like, no, that definitely is, a 4-point tie-off pattern he hasn't seen since his last deployment. That's a Kandahar field stitch. That's the kind of tie-off you learned when you were working in a hospital tent under mortar fire and didn't have the luxury of calling for a surgical tech if something came loose. He doesn't ask her where she learned it. He doesn't say anything at all. He just makes a note in his mind that there's more to the quiet trauma nurse in the oversized scrubs than her personnel file probably indicates. The morning moves forward with the ordinary rhythm of a hospital that's seen 3,000 Tuesday mornings and will see 3,000 more. An 82-year-old woman arrives with chest pain. A construction worker with a lacerated forearm. A child with acute appendicitis, the kind that makes the ER staff move with purposeful urgency. Megan flows through each case with the kind of seamless efficiency that comes from either extensive training or something else entirely, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things the world has to offer. She starts 4s on the first stick. She has medications prepared before doctors ask for them. She anticipates the next procedure step before anyone articulates it. By noon, the nursing staff has begun to notice her, though not in the warm way that builds relationships. Instead, there's a quality of observation. A watching. A measuring. As if they're trying to figure out whether she belongs or whether she's something that washed in from somewhere else and simply hasn't washed back out again. In the supply closet at 13:35, Megan photographs the 5th batch of morphine vials this month. Rerouted through the same supplier. The patient in bed 7 now has a visitor who claims to be his brother, though the facial structures suggest no biological relation. She photographs the visitor's ID badge through a crack in the doorway. She documents the time. She notes the patient's response, a subtle nod, a sealed envelope exchanged with the fluidity of a transaction performed before. By 1600 hours, she's transmitted the images to an encrypted email account that will be checked by eyes she'll never meet, in offices she'll never see, as part of an operation she'll never fully understand. That's the arrangement. That's the contract. Show up. Document. Stay invisible. Let the people with stars on their shoulders worry about the implications. Dr. Mercer passes her in the hallway at 14:30 and doesn't acknowledge her. She's already forgotten he was watching her during the central line insertion. But he hasn't forgotten. He's made a note somewhere in the architecture of his mind that there's something off about her, something that doesn't quite match the resume, the credentials, the way she moves through the unit like she's done this before in a place that looked nothing like this. He'll file it away. He'll pull it out later when he has time to think about what it means that a trauma nurse can place a central line in 40 seconds. That's when the real problems will begin. But that's not what happens now. Now, the unit settles into its evening rhythm. The fluorescent lights hum. The monitors beep their mechanical songs. Somewhere in the building, Dr. Reynolds finishes his shift and thinks about that Kandahar field stitch and decides, for now, to keep his observations to himself. And Megan O'Brien hangs her jacket in locker 47, touches the unit patch sewn into the lining, Valkyrie 6, faded to almost nothing, and walks out into the Raleigh evening where rain has begun to fall on hot asphalt, and the world, for one more day, has no idea who it's standing next to. The rain on hot asphalt smelled like copper and diesel, the kind of smell that pulled muscle memory from places Megan O'Brien had spent 5 years trying to forget. She sat in the hospital parking lot for 3 minutes before walking in, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her breathing measured. The faded unit patch inside her jacket pocket, Valkyrie 6, worn to almost nothing, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She touched it once. Then she clocked in. St. Michael's Hospital at 6:08 a.m. was all fluorescent hum and antiseptic. The trauma ward was already moving. Nurses passed each other with practiced efficiency, charts held like weapons, coffee cups steaming in the cold corridor air. Megan's badge clattered softly as she walked, the sound barely cutting through the ventilator wheeze coming from room 412. Mr. Patterson had come out of hernia surgery 4 hours ago. His wife, Mrs. Patterson, sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed, her knuckles white around a foam coffee cup that had gone cold somewhere around midnight. Megan checked his vitals. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate 82. O2 sat 96. But his face was tight with pain, the kind of pain that lives in post-op recovery, surgical, sharp, the body's protest against cutting and stitching. She looked at his chart. Dr. Mercer's orders, 5 milligrams morphine every 4 hours, which would be appropriate for a 180-pound man in moderate pain, except Mr. Patterson was 147 pounds and his respiratory rate was already climbing at 18 breaths per minute. Push 5 milligrams morphine into someone that small with that baseline, and you flatten his breathing inside 2 hours. You create the problem you're trying to solve. Megan adjusted the 4-infusion pump. 2.5 milligrams instead. Half dose. Titrated properly. She was documenting the change when the doors swung open with the force of someone who had never learned to open them gently. Dr. Mercer entered like a man who believed the room had been waiting for him. Tall, expensively cut hair going grey at exactly the right temples, a watch that cost more than Megan's monthly rent, a Rolex Submariner, 18-karat gold, the kind worn by surgeons who knew they'd never have to explain their purchases to anyone. He was moving toward Mr. Patterson's bed with a kind of velocity that made Mrs. Patterson straighten in her chair, suddenly aware that something was about to happen. "Nurse O'Brien." His voice carried the particular disdain of a man accustomed to being right. "Did you even read the chart, or do you just modify physician orders based on your gut feeling?" Megan didn't look up from the pump. Her jaw tightened, a single muscle movement, nothing more. She finished documenting. Then she turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. "The protocol you wrote would have stopped his breathing in approximately 120 minutes, Doctor." Her voice was quiet. Measured. The kind of quiet that made people lean in to hear it. "His respiratory rate is already 18. Morphine at that dose would suppress him further. At his weight, 2.5 milligrams is the appropriate titration. I saved you a malpractice suit." Mrs. Patterson made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more a caught breath. Her husband's eyes moved between Megan and Mercer like he was watching something he didn't understand. Mercer's face flushed, not the crimson of embarrassment, but the shade of anger, the color of a man unused to being contradicted by someone wearing scrubs. He smiled. It was the worst thing he could have done, because the smile meant he was already planning something. He turned to Mrs. Patterson, his voice shifting to something approximating compassion, the tone doctors use when they're about to make a point at someone else's expense. "You see how she talks to physicians?" He gestured vaguely toward Megan, as if she were a creature in a zoo. "This is what happens when credentials become suggestions instead of requirements." Megan felt it then, the single tear that escaped before she could stop it. Not from anger. Not from fear. From exhaustion. From the weight of being watched constantly, of having every decision questioned, of standing in a room where everyone had decided who you were before you opened your mouth. The tear tracked down her cheek and she let it. She didn't brush it away immediately. Instead, she held Mercer's gaze with the kind of eye contact that made him shift his weight slightly, that made him understand that she was not a nurse who cried because she was weak. She was a nurse who cried because she was human. Then she wiped it with a single, deliberate movement of her index finger. Her hand didn't shake. "I've closed chest cavities with less sterile conditions than your mouth, Doctor." The room went dead silent. Mrs. Patterson's coffee cup hovered halfway to her lips. A nurse passing in the hallway actually slowed her pace, as if she'd heard something she wanted to remember exactly. Mercer's smile died. His face cycled through 4 different shades of red before settling on the color of pure administrative rage. He didn't respond. He turned and left, his movement sharp enough to cut. But that wasn't the worst part. By 11:22 a.m., Megan sat in the break room with a salad that she'd brought from home in a Tupperware container. The lettuce was going slightly brown at the edges. She ate methodically, 1 forkful at a time, not because she was hungry but because it was a practical use of her 30 minutes. Around her, the hospital moved through lunch hour with its usual chaos. But something had shifted. 4 of the senior nurses, Linda Chen, who'd been at St. Michael's for 19 years, Marcus Webb, a veteran with steady hands and steadier judgment, Jennifer Rodriguez, who taught new nurses the difference between protocol and intuition, David Kim, who still knew how to do everything because he'd never stopped paying attention. They came in together, gathered their lunches, and migrated to the far table within 30 seconds of Megan sitting down. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't acknowledge her. They just left, a coordinated movement that was clearly coordinated. Linda said something Megan wasn't meant to hear but was absolutely meant to hear anyway. I heard she's under investigation. Mercer told me. Something about her credentials not checking out. The other nurses nodded in that way people do when they're accepting information from someone they trust, and Linda Chen had been trusted at St. Michael's longer than most of them had worked there. The break room suddenly felt very large. Megan's salad tasted like nothing. She finished it anyway, rinsed the container in the sink, and returned to the floor. Her hand was tremoring slightly, not from fear, but from the particular kind of anger that comes from being isolated, from being poisoned in the collective consciousness before you've had a chance to defend yourself. She pressed her palm flat against the counter in the supply room for exactly 6 seconds. The tremor stopped. She clocked back in. By 2:15 p.m., every nurse on the floor had seen the write-up. It was posted on the unit board outside the nurses' station, formal letterhead, hospital logo at the top, the kind of documentation that changed careers. Disciplinary notice. The words were in bold. Megan O'Brien, RN. Failure to follow chain of command. Unauthorized modification of physician orders. Below that, in smaller text, the details, the incident from 3 days ago when she'd caught Mercer's dosage calculation error on a post-op patient and corrected it without informing him first, which, technically, if you read the policies the way Mercer read them, was a violation of hierarchical protocol, even though it had saved the patient from kidney damage. Mercer stood 3 feet away from the board, pretending to review charts, occasionally glancing up to watch staff members arrive at the bulletin, read it, and move away with something shifted in their faces. When Megan arrived, when she read her own public humiliation spelled out in 12-point Arial font, he didn't pretend anymore. He watched her. He waited for her to fall apart, to cry, to storm to the administrator's office, to do something that would confirm his narrative that she was unstable, that she didn't belong, that his concerns about her credentials had been justified all along. She read it once. She reached into her jacket pocket and touched the faded unit patch, not consciously, just muscle memory, just the reminder that she'd survived worse than a piece of paper. Then she walked away. Her back was straight. Her breathing was controlled. She didn't run. She didn't hide in a supply closet. She clocked out for her break and sat in her car for 10 minutes and let herself think about the fact that Dr. Mercer was going to escalate, that this was only the beginning, that he'd tasted blood and wouldn't stop now. When she returned to the floor, he was waiting. "Hey, clipboard." His voice carried across the hallway, loud enough for 3 other staff members to hear it, carefully calibrated for maximum humiliation. "Did you even pass the NCLEX on your first try, or did someone feel sorry for you? Maybe your investigation will find out what we're all wondering." The room contracted. Megan stopped walking. She turned toward him with a kind of deliberate movement that suggested she'd made a decision about how to spend the next 3 seconds of her life. Her eyes were flat. Her voice was quieter than his. "Just the once, doctor. Same number of tries it took you to kill your first patient, I imagine." He didn't respond. He didn't have anything in his arsenal that matched the precision of that statement. Instead, he turned away, and Megan saw it, the moment his hand curled into a fist, the moment he understood that she wouldn't break, that insults weren't going to work, that whatever he'd planned next was going to have to be something else entirely. Something strategic. Something with teeth. But for now, the shift continued. Megan worked through 7 p.m., checking vitals, documenting changes, moving through the hospital with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. She was a nurse, just a nurse, and that was enough. The world didn't know what it was standing next to. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. And somewhere in the building, Dr. Mercer was making phone calls. The appendectomy was routine. Bleeding vessel. Nothing that required genius, just precision. Megan knelt beside the open abdomen, her gloved hands moving with the fluid economy of someone who'd tied off bleeders in conditions far worse than a sterile OR. Lap sponges. Clamps. The attending surgeon, Dr. Reynolds, watched from across the table, his eyes narrowed behind his mask. She didn't notice him watching. She was already somewhere else, her hands remembering what her mouth could never say. 4-point tie-off. Suture material thin as spider silk. Her fingers didn't shake. Her breathing stayed level. The technique was muscle memory, the kind you only acquired by doing it 300 times under mortar fire, stabilizing field hospital patients while rounds impacted the sandbags above your head. Reynolds's eyes tracked every movement. The way she positioned the knot. The angle of her fingers. The speed. That wasn't nursing school technique. That wasn't residency training. That was something older. Something earned in dust and blood. He watched for another 30 seconds. Then, soft enough that the surgical techs couldn't hear, he leaned closer. "Where'd you learn to suture like that?" His voice was barely above a whisper, a single thread of sound across the sterile field. Megan didn't look up. Her hands continued their work. She knew exactly what he was asking. Not where she'd gone to school. Not which textbook she'd memorized. He was asking which combat theater. Which unit? Which year? The Kandahar field stitch was signature work, the way you tied off a brachial artery when your OR was a tent and your instruments were whatever you could sterilize in a metal basin. It had a name because soldiers knew it. Because medics who'd survived knew it. Because the ones who'd learned it had learned it from necessity, not curriculum. Megan tied the final knot without hesitation. "Private instruction," she said quietly. Still didn't look at him. Reynolds straightened slightly. A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but waited. He'd just confirmed what he already knew. She wasn't running from something. She was running toward something else entirely. The patient's abdomen was clean now, bleeding controlled. The surgery was over in 17 minutes flat. Reynolds nodded once to the scrub nurse. "Close him up." His gaze flicked back to Megan. Just for a fraction of a second. The look that passed between them had no words. Former service members recognized each other the way old predators did, by the weight they carried, the way they moved through space like they'd already survived things most people couldn't imagine. Reynolds had been a flight surgeon in the Navy. 23 years, early retirement, honorable discharge. He'd seen combat medicine in helicopter LZs and field hospitals in the Horn of Africa. He'd also seen the paperwork of someone like her, someone on active orders, carrying a cover story that was just plausible enough to hold, moving through civilian spaces like a ghost in a uniform that nobody could see. He didn't say anything else. That was how you protected people like Megan. You saw them. You didn't acknowledge it. You moved on. By 1400 hours, Megan was back in the break room, nursing a cooling cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. Her assignment at St. Michael's was supposed to be simple. 90 days. Observe one target patient. A procurement officer named Mitchell Reeves, who worked in the hospital's medical supply division and had been flagged by Army intelligence for suspected unauthorized sales of Class A medical equipment to buyers in the Eastern Mediterranean. The kind of sales that didn't appear in official channels. The kind that ended up in field hospitals run by people who shouldn't have had them. The Pentagon didn't care if Reeves was selling supplies to opposition forces or rival warlords or private military contractors. They cared about the chain of command being broken. About inventory disappearing into the black market. About the security breach. Megan's job was simple: observe, document, report. Keep her cover as a trauma nurse airtight. Say nothing about the classified briefings she'd attended at a secure facility near Fort Liberty. Say nothing about the encrypted phone that looked like a vintage Samsung but was actually a direct line to the Army Counterintelligence Division. Say nothing about the fact that everything in her background was real except the parts that mattered. The real parts. The parts where she'd spent 5 years before St. Michael's in the 75th Ranger Regiment. 5 years. 187 combat missions. Kandahar, Helmand Province, Jalalabad. Surgical experience that came from keeping people alive when the operating room was a convoy truck and the anesthesiologist was your own adrenaline. The unit patch was still in her jacket. Faded now, maybe 2 inches square, featuring her insignia that soldiers recognized instantly if they'd served. She kept it sewn into the lining of her trauma jacket because she couldn't throw it away. Because it was the only piece of her real life that went to work with her every day. The break room was empty except for her. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous buzz, a sound that made her teeth itch. She'd been here for 93 days. 2 more weeks and the assignment would be complete. Reeves would be arrested. The supply chain would be secured. She'd get her next deployment orders. Her daughter would spend another 3 months asking why mommy had to work such long nights. And Megan would go back to being invisible. It was the trade-off. The part nobody prepared you for. Not the combat. Not the trauma. Not the impossible medical decisions that kept you awake until 0400 with your chest tight and your hands remembering exactly what they'd done. The part they didn't prepare you for was coming home and pretending to be smaller than you actually were. Pretending that your hands didn't know how to do things that civilians couldn't fathom. Pretending that the person you'd become in Kandahar could fit back inside a skin that was supposed to work in peacetime. Her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. The message appeared in code, 3 digits that meant nothing unless you knew the cipher. 281, status request. Reeves's office had been flagged on the surveillance network. He was moving documents. Something was happening faster than the scheduled timeline. Megan stared at the message for exactly 4 seconds. Then she erased it. She stood, set the coffee cup down with a soft clink of ceramic. The break room door hissed open. She moved into the corridor toward the supply closet where she'd been restocking the crash cart, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The intelligence would have to wait. Right now, a patient in bed 7 needed pain management that Dr. Mercer had underdosed, and her job, the real job, the one that didn't require codes or encrypted phones, was to save people. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Mercer was checking his phone. Making plans. Calling in favors. Building a case that would destroy her career in the next 48 hours. He didn't know about the faded unit patch. He didn't know about the 5 years. He didn't know that the woman he'd chosen to target had spent 18 months training for hand-to-hand combat and another 14 months learning how to incapacitate targets silently. He thought she was a nurse. That was the mistake that would change everything. The marble lobby of St. Michael's gleamed like a surgical theater under afternoon light. Megan restocked the crash cart near the main entrance, her hands moving through the ritual with practiced precision, checking bandage counts, verifying medication vials, ensuring the defibrillator pads were sealed. Tuesday, 2:34 p.m. She didn't know Senator Richard Hale was walking through those doors behind a hospital PR team, didn't know his left lung was already dying, didn't know the next 4 minutes would detonate her entire operation. The senator's entourage moved toward the administrator's office, 6 people, clipboard carriers, a local news crew filming B-roll of the hospital's new pediatric wing. Hale wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Megan's monthly rent, moved with the effortless authority of a man who'd never been told no. He smiled for the cameras. He gestured toward the emergency department in trance with the kind of confidence that came from 40 years of decision-making that affected thousands. Then his hand went to his chest. His face changed in a way that told Megan everything before his knees buckled. Not a heart attack, the pressure was too centered, the breathing too shallow. Pulmonary embolism. A blood clot had traveled from somewhere in his legs, lodged in his pulmonary artery, and now his lungs were suffocating while his heart pumped against dead weight. The entourage scattered. One aide screamed for security. The news crew kept filming. Megan moved. Not ran. Walked with the measured speed of someone who'd done this under mortar fire and didn't need to panic now. She was at his side before his body hit the floor, her hand already moving to his neck, fingers finding the carotid pulse, faint, erratic, dropping. "Get crash cart," she said to the nearest staff member. Not a request. A command that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than a trauma nurse's training manual. Now. Dr. Mercer emerged from the cardiology corridor, stopped, assessed the scene, and froze. His mouth opened. Closed. He stood paralyzed while a senator convulsed on his hospital's marble floor, which was exactly what Megan had expected. Some doctors froze when the patient was too important. Some froze when the stakes were too high. Mercer froze because he'd never seen battlefield medicine applied in real time. She positioned Hale's body supine, tilted his head back, assessed his airway. His O2 sat was falling, 88, 84, 79. The crackle in his lungs told her everything about where the clot had lodged. She didn't wait for the cart. She didn't wait for permission. Her left hand pressed between his ribs at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomically precise location where a needle could puncture the pleural cavity and collapse the tension pneumothorax that was killing him. A 14-gauge angiocath needle from her pocket, trauma nurses carried them because trauma nurses understood that protocol was written by people who'd never heard rounds incoming. She pushed through skin and muscle, felt the give when the needle broke the pleural membrane, and the hiss of trapped air escaping told her the diagnosis was confirmed. The senator's breathing eased fractionally. O2 sat climbing. 80, 85. 91. But the clot was still there. His heart was still fighting a blockage, and the needle was only a stopgap, a temporary pressure relief that bought minutes, not hours. The crash cart arrived, 3 nurses, defibrillator, full code equipment. Mercer still hadn't moved. He watched as Megan stripped off her jacket, revealing the trauma shears on her belt, and then something else. The tattoo on her inner wrist. A call sign, V6. Valkyrie 6. Registration number for a unit that had never officially existed. She asked for a scalpel from the crash cart without breaking eye contact with the senator's chest. Someone handed it to her, and in that moment, 6 years fell away, the cover identity, the scrubs, the careful deference to Dr. Mercer's authority. What remained was a woman who'd held a soldier's open chest cavity while explosions shook the operating tent, who'd known the difference between surgical precision and battlefield necessity, who'd learned that sometimes the only way to save a life was to be willing to break every rule written by people who'd never stood in the blood-soaked dust of Kandahar. The scalpel was dull, meant for sutures, but it was sharp enough for what she needed. An anterolateral thoracotomy, emergency access through the 4th intercostal space. She opened his chest on the marble floor of the lobby while a senator's blood ran across the tiles and hospital staff froze and cameras kept rolling. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 17 times in a field hospital operating tent with mortar rounds punching through the roof. She reached for the clot. A trained surgeon would have called for proper equipment, would have escalated to the OR, would have done everything by protocol. A trained surgeon had never been in Kandahar. Megan's fingers found the pulmonary artery, palpated the embolus, a massive clot, probably 3 inches long, the kind that kills quietly in a hospital bed. She worked it free with the precision of someone removing a tumor from living tissue while also being very aware that one slip meant this senator died on the floor of his own constituent's hospital. The clot came free. Blood pulsed through the artery, sudden and strong, and the senator's oxygen saturation jumped to 94%, then 96%. Cardiac monitor beeped sinus rhythm. Strong, steady, the rhythm of a man who was no longer dying. Level 1, Duke, she said, looking up at the trauma nurse. Notify them we're incoming. Code Trauma 1 with emergency thoracotomy in field. ETA 14 minutes. Her voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone who'd never doubted for a second that this would work. 2 large bore 4s, push half a unit O negative, and someone find me a sterile field because this man needs proper closure and his insides are very much exposed on a lobby floor. They moved. The trauma team snapped into action with the urgency of watching a nurse who actually knew what she was doing. The stretcher came, the transport protocol began, and the senator, pale, shocked, alive, was wheeled toward the ambulance while his blood stained Megan's hands and uniform. She stood slowly, her breathing controlled, her expression flat. The cameras were still rolling. Mercer's face had gone the color of old concrete. The hospital administrator stared like he was watching a woman shed a skin and reveal scales underneath. Megan walked to the sink in the nearby break room and washed her hands while a senator traveled to Duke and a room full of people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. She dried her hands on a paper towel and walked back to the trauma bay, where the day's other patients were waiting, where protocol demanded she return to normal operations, where her cover identity was still supposed to mean something. Dr. Mercer cornered the hospital administrator within an hour. Emergency procedures require authorization, Mercer said, his voice steady now, reasserting itself through the shock. What she did was reckless, outside scope of practice, potentially dangerous despite the outcome. The administrator hesitated. Outcomes mattered, but so did procedure. Megan had saved the senator's life, but she'd also opened a chest on a hospital floor without surgical consent, without proper equipment, without the chain of command that Mercer represented. Mercer made 3 phone calls. To board members. To the North Carolina Medical Board. To an outside hospital attorney. By 4:13 p.m., Megan's security badge was deactivated. By 5:15 p.m., security was escorting her to her locker. By 5:34 p.m., she was driving home with a cardboard box containing her stethoscope, a photo of Emma, and the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the patch that meant Valkyrie 6, that meant 7 years of intelligence operations, that meant this assignment was about to explode into something neither Mercer nor the hospital could control. Her daughter's school bus arrived at 3:15 the next day. Emma walked into the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder, and found her mother sitting at the table in the clothes she'd worn yesterday. Still drying blood under one fingernail. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "Why are you home? Did you get fired like Daddy did before he left?" Megan pulled her daughter into her lap and couldn't speak for 30 seconds. Her hands, which had held a senator's beating heart, trembled for the first time that week. "No, baby. Mommy's just having a hard day." "Did you do something wrong?" "I did exactly what I was trained to do." "Sometimes that's not enough." Megan pressed her forehead against Emma's hair and allowed herself to break. One afternoon of grief, one daughter who didn't understand, one classified mission unraveling while her supervisor filed paperwork to destroy her credentials. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 5 days later. Within 90 minutes of the senator's transport leaving St. Michael's lobby, Dr. Mercer was on the phone. Not to the attending board. Not to hospital counsel. To the people who owed him. 3 board members, Sterling, Conrad, Hayes, all of them had sat beside him on credentialing committees, all of them had benefited from his recommendations when their own careers needed oxygen. Mercer collected favors the way other men collected watches. He was calling them in. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man whose confidence was not performance but fact. "I need you to understand what happened today. A nurse, unvetted, possibly fraudulent credentials, performed an authorized surgical intervention on a senator. Emergency or not, protocol exists for a reason. I've documented everything. I'm filing with the board. Sterling said he'd need to discuss with counsel. Mercer didn't accept that. Discuss now. She endangered a patient. I have witnesses. By 11:30 that morning, a second call went to the North Carolina Medical Board. Not from Mercer himself, too direct, too obvious. From a hospital administrator reading from a script Mercer had written. We have evidence of credential falsification and unauthorized surgical procedures performed by nursing staff. We're requesting immediate investigation into one Megan O'Brien, RN. Patient safety was compromised. We're self-reporting to demonstrate institutional compliance. The board received the complaint at 12:04 p.m. on a Thursday. They logged it. They assigned a case number. They didn't yet know they were investigating a decorated Army captain who had saved a senator's life under conditions that would make most surgeons weep. They only knew the words on the form. Patient endangerment. Unauthorized procedures. Credential concern. By 1 o'clock, an outside hospital attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance who had never met Megan but who had been retained by Mercer's network specifically for situations like this, was reviewing the emergency department footage. Not to confirm the save. To document the deviation from protocol. The thoracotomy with a scalpel from the crash cart. The needle decompression without a physician present. The speed of it. The precision of it. All of it, Mercer had argued, was unauthorized. All of it was procedure violation. Vance made notes. She had 15 years of hospital law. She knew how to read a narrative to the board specifications. By 1:38 p.m., Mercer walked into the administrator's office with Vance beside him. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Megan's badge was deactivated by 2:03 p.m. The email notification appeared in the hospital system at 2:15 p.m., and within an hour, someone had cleared out her locker. Her trauma shears, her personal items, the faded unit patch she kept sewn inside the lining of her old jacket, all of it was boxed and left at the security office. She was suspended pending investigation, the official letter read. Effective immediately. Her access to the hospital network was revoked. Her contact information was flagged in the system. Do not rehire without legal clearance. The speed of it was stunning. The efficiency of it was devastating. What Mercer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Megan's position at St. Michael's was never about her nursing license. It was about Operation Valkyrie. About Army intelligence. About a 5-year surveillance mission tracking military medical supply chain fraud. Marcus Webb, the anesthesiologist who had whispered about her Kandahar field stitches, was the primary target. Marcus Webb, who had been selling classified fentanyl to foreign buyers through a network of hospital contacts. Marcus Webb, who had moved $240,000 in contraband equipment over 3 years. Megan's forced suspension meant the operation ended. Her cover was burned. The surveillance was over. The mission had failed in its final weeks, just as they were building toward Marcus's arrest. 36 hours before the suspension, Megan had photographed Marcus's ledger. 72 hours before, she had documented his dead drop location. The timeline was meant to converge. Instead, it collapsed. The Pentagon would find out in 5 days. That was when they would discover that the North Carolina Medical Board investigation had been triggered by a physician with no security clearance, no knowledge of her true assignment, no awareness that he had just compromised a classified military operation. That evening at 3:12 p.m., Megan sat at her kitchen table in a small rental house 2 miles from St. Michael's. The house was quiet in that way houses are quiet when they're supposed to be full of noise. Emma's backpack hung by the door, the backpack that was supposed to be picked up at 5:15 p.m. from her after-school program. Megan hadn't moved in 4 hours. She'd driven home. She'd made tea. She'd forgotten the tea. The cup sat beside her, skin forming on top of the lukewarm surface, a thin membrane of abandonment. Rain hammered the kitchen windows. The kind of October rain that sounds like judgment. She was still in her scrubs. Still wore the badge holder clip to her waistband, though the badge itself was gone. Just an empty plastic clip on empty scrubs. The fluorescent overhead light hummed. Once. Twice. Again. Her hands rested on the table. Steady. Professional. The hands that had held a senator's beating heart 24 hours earlier. The hands that had closed a chest cavity with a combat field stitch. The hands that had saved lives in 3 countries. Now they looked useless. At 5:51 p.m., Emma's voice came before Emma did. High-pitched, animated, excited in the way 7-year-olds are excited about nothing in particular. "Mommy's here." Then Emma rounded the corner, still wearing her after-school program ID badge, a popsicle stick in her hand shaped like a butterfly, the kind of treasure only children understand. "Mommy, I made it." Emma stopped. The child saw what the child saw. A woman in scrubs at a kitchen table at 5:47 in the afternoon. Rain still hammering. The tea growing colder. Her mother's eyes that had never cried in public, that had never trembled under pressure, that had stayed perfectly dry through every humiliation Mercer could manufacture, those eyes were wet. Not red. Not streaming. Just wet. The way a surface looks when you've spilled something and haven't wiped it yet. "Mommy." Emma's voice changed. Children hear the shift in the world like animals hear earthquakes. "Why are you home? Did you get fired?" The question landed like a punch. Not from the question itself, but from what it meant. From what Emma had learned to associate with 3 p.m. arrivals on a weekday. Emma's father had been home at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. He had also been unemployed. He had also left 3 weeks later. Emma had made the connection with the merciless logic of a child who had lived that story once and recognized its opening act. Megan wiped her eyes with her knuckles. Not a gesture soldiers learn. A gesture mothers learn. "No, baby. Not fired. It's complicated." That's what Daddy said. Emma sat down, still holding her popsicle stick butterfly. The butterfly was slightly misshapen. One wing was bigger than the other. Emma didn't seem to notice. "Are you and me staying here?" "Yes." "For how long?" Megan looked at her daughter. Really looked at her. 7 years old. Born during a deployment rotation. Raised partly by a grandmother because Megan had been assigned overseas. Now looking at her mother with the eyes of someone preparing for abandonment. "As long as we need to, sweetheart. I promise." Emma nodded. She'd learned to accept promises as the best tool available. She'd learned it from a man who had said the same words and meant them at the time. "Okay." She set the butterfly on the table. "Can I have a snack?" That was how it worked. That was how the world ended. Not in thunder. In a child asking about snacks. The next morning, hospital counsel would issue a formal statement, suspension under review pending investigation findings. The North Carolina Medical Board would begin their intake interview. News would run with the angle that hospital staff had reported safety concerns. Nobody would know yet that the person reporting was a physician with a personal vendetta and a collapsing career. Nobody would know that every claim was false. Nobody would know that within 5 days, a Pentagon briefing would detonate everything Mercer had built. Within 5 days, his network of favors would dissolve like sugar in rain. Within 5 days, federal investigators would pull security footage, the footage he had attempted to delete, and discover that Dr. Marcus Webb had been removing controlled substances from the pharmacy for 17 months. Within 5 days, Megan's badge would be restored with back pay. Within 5 days, Mercer would learn that his contact with hospital network security had been logged, documented, and reported to federal prosecutors under obstruction of justice statutes. Within 5 days, everything would reverse. But on that Thursday evening, Megan didn't know any of that. She only knew rain. She only knew Emma asking for snacks. She only knew that her classified mission was compromised, her cover was burned, and the people she worked for would be calling her tomorrow to explain why she had let a surgeon with a personal grudge destroy an operation 5 years in the making. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that this suspension, this humiliation, this destruction of her reputation, it was only possible because she couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain her military service. She couldn't explain her training. She couldn't explain that the procedures Mercer called unauthorized were exactly what kept the senator alive. She couldn't say any of it because saying it meant exposing the operation. Meant confirming the cover story Mercer had crafted was based on something real. So she sat there. She accepted the suspension. She drove home. She cried at the kitchen table while her daughter asked if Mommy was getting fired. And she waited. In 72 hours, the Pentagon would move. In 5 days, the investigation would begin. In 5 days, everything would change. But right now, in this moment, Megan O'Brien was just a woman in scrubs at a kitchen table, watching rain on the window, listening to her daughter eat crackers with peanut butter, and holding a secret that would take the entire machinery of the federal government to expose. If you believe in quiet heroes, the ones who save lives in the dark, the ones who can't defend themselves, the ones who endure humiliation because the mission matters more than their reputation, then you understand why Megan sat at that table and said nothing. Hit that subscribe button. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?